Welcome to this videocast from Australian Community Futures Planning on the State of Australia in 2020. I'm Bronwyn Kelly, the founder of ACFP, and this series covers the facts about the health and well-being of Australia's society, environment, economy and democracy. The issues listed here are among the most important for Australia to solve before 2030. Failure to make substantial progress on these issues in the coming decade will make it harder and far more costly for Australians to arrive safely in 2050 with an acceptable degree of well-being and security. Australian Community Futures Planning is working with Australians to develop a plan to overcome the challenging issues raised in this series. That plan is called Australia Together. This is Australia's first National Community Futures Plan. It is being developed by Australians for Australians and is designed to increase our chances of arriving safely at our preferred future by 2050 or sooner. Factual details and data presented in this series provide the starting points for Australia Together. They pinpoint some of our biggest weaknesses as a nation in 2020. As such, they form the basis for some of the most ambitious targets that Australians can draft into their first National Community Futures Plan. The full set of 7 videocasts on the State of Australia in 2020 covers facts about 20 key issues for Australia. This episode covers issue number 1 on growing inequality, issue 2 on the growth in poverty, hunger and homelessness, issue 3 on how the fair go for all Australians has been lost, issue 4 on the disturbing growth in racial and religious conflict, and issue 5 on the systemically embedded exclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, Australia's First Nations. You can pause this video at any time to consider the points and statistics provided. For the remaining episodes in the State of Australia in 2020, visit the ACFP website at www.austcfp.com.au. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians are respectfully advised that this videocast contains references to deceased persons. Other Australians may find the totality of this summary picture of the State of Australia in 2020 to be confronting. All attempts have been made to ensure that selected statistics and commentary are verifiable. For more supporting information, viewers may follow the sources provided or read detailed source material provided on the ACFP website. Australia and Australians themselves are wealthy by comparison to other nations. But our national wealth, the wealth we work hard to generate, isn't being fairly shared. The Australian Bureau of Statistics has been monitoring income inequality since 1994 and wealth inequality since 2003. This monitoring has uncovered a continuous worsening trend over the last 15 to 20 years. Inequality is growing in Australia in terms of both annual income and accumulated wealth for individuals. The gap between rich and poor has been widening continuously since the mid-1990s. Results from the Australian Bureau of Statistics' most recent monitoring have shown that since 2014, the wealthiest 25% of Australians have increased their income by nearly double that of median household incomes, while the wealth holdings of the poorest 20% of households have actually declined. The average net worth of the top 20% of households is now more than 93 times that of the lowest 20%, some $3.2 million for the top 20% compared to just $35,200 for the lowest 20%. The wealth of the average Australian household has surged past 1 million, but low-income families have not seen any increase in their net worth for more than a decade. Wealth inequality and income inequality are now both at their highest levels since the ABS surveys of inequality began. This doesn't bode well for our economy. When too many people have too little to spend, an economy will shrink, not grow. But it also bodes ill for our resilience as a nation and our ability to handle crises like pandemics and climate change. Studies such as those conducted by eminent British epidemiologists Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett in their groundbreaking 2009 book, The Spirit Level, have shown clearly that improved well-being in a developed country like Australia arises not so much from continued economic growth, but from fair sharing of any growth in national wealth and income. And we can expect that if an economic contraction coincides with growth in inequality, this will be an explosive combination capable of destroying our cohesion as a society. Government policy settings in 2020 that are aggravating this problem include historically low top marginal tax rates, increases in average tax from low and middle income earners, and substantial drops in tax for high income earners. Over the next decade, Australians will experience a rise in the average tax gathered from middle and low income earners, hitting those earning below $58,000 especially hard. By contrast, the top 20% of earners will experience a drop in their average tax, and the top 1% of earners will experience a drop of more than $11,000 a year in their tax. These regressive changes in taxation have been legislated. In other words, we've legislated to make the tax system more unfair. And more than that, the legislated tax changes have presented Australians with a big problem that will aggravate unfairness in access to the services we value. They have removed a total of $302 billion from the revenue we would otherwise have put aside from our income tax over the next decade for vital services such as health and education. We have legislated to delete an amount that is almost the equivalent of the full year's worth of income tax received by the government in 2017-18, $312 billion. That's the equivalent of deleting funding for the entirety of what the Commonwealth Government budgeted to spend in 2019-20 on social security, welfare, health and education, which was $298 billion. It also deletes our entire capacity to repay the public debt we have now taken on due to COVID-19, new debt which, as at August 2020, started at $289 billion. The implicit assumption behind the tax cuts legislated in 2018 and 2019 is that somewhere between 2019 and 2029, we could, in theory, live for a year, at least in today's dollars, without having to pay for our pensions, Medicare, family tax benefit, disability support pension, pharmaceutical benefits, carer income support, and the federal government's entire contribution to schools and higher education. Their cost for a full year is about the same amount as we have deleted by our tax cuts. It seems unimaginable now, especially with our new COVID-19 debt, but when the tax cuts were legislated, we were, nevertheless, imagining that somewhere, somehow in the next decade, we could give ourselves a year-long holiday from paying income tax, and that there would be no unwished-for effect on our economy or service levels. Of course, the effect on our service levels was always going to be felt deeply. According to the 2019-20 budget, federal spending per capita will be increased over the next decade. But in the fine print, we can see that it will not be increasing to the extent we will need, and not on what we might prefer. The government has been seriously restraining expenditure on services. Since 2013, federal spending per capita has declined. And in its 2019-20 budget, the federal government projected a continuation of that restraint. In the 20 years from 1992 to 2012, federal spending on services for each Australian increased on average by 2.6% a year. But in the coming decade, the decade to 2030, spending is projected to increase by only 0.6% per annum, per capita, well below what we've been used to. This is guaranteed to deliver Australians a worse standard of living, especially when it is combined with rising housing costs and flattened wages. But not only are we being set on track to lose services that help all Australians maintain the standard of living we have worked hard to achieve, we are being set on track to increase inequity to such a point that our economy will shrink. The tax cuts legislated in 2018 and 2019 were sold to Australians on the basis of a number of falsehoods, but a key one was that the government would not be asking for the money back. In the government's advertising cell, we would all get to keep our tax cuts, and the theory was that the tiny amount of increased spending we were being permitted with our bigger take-home wages would stimulate the economy and do so fairly. But it's not going to work out that way, and it is clear that the current government does not intend that it should. Not all of us will get to keep our tax cuts. The budget papers show that the government expects that personal income tax savings will not be kept by lower income taxpayers. Total income tax receipts, which constitute about half of all federal government revenues and are currently equal to 11.5% of the total economy, are budgeted to begin growing again by the mid-2020s and are expected to grow to a point where income tax constitutes a higher percentage of GDP than it does now. The Parliamentary Budget Office has noted that this increase occurs even after factoring in all the stages of the government's personal income tax cuts as announced in the 2018-19 and 2019-20 budgets. This might be quite acceptable were it not for the fact that, contrary to the impression created in the pre-election period of 2019 that strong economic managers in the government wouldn't need our taxes, they have structured the tax cuts to ensure they won't have to do without our taxes down the track. In structuring the tax cuts the way we have taken over $302 billion out of the public sector's contribution to the total size of our economy. But from about the mid-2020s, the poorest of us will be required to put it all back and more. Because of the way the new tax brackets have been structured, average total taxes will grow for those at the bottom, and average total taxes for those at the top will drop. Those earning below $58,000 will be hardest hit. Those at the top will bear less burden than they ever have before. It is the poorest who will be funding budgeted increases in spending on a small number of selected items over the next decade. The poorest will be funding program spending increases on the National Disability Insurance Scheme, Defence, aged care, Medicare, and childcare. The poorest will fund all this in the 2020s by a combination of a rise in their average tax and a forced sacrifice of service levels in every other area. Over the decade, services which are set to receive no increase at all in their current share of the nation's wealth include public hospitals, carer income support, schools, the age pension, and parenting payments. Items set to receive less in shares of national wealth include the unemployment benefit, road and rail infrastructure, Commonwealth grants, the disability support pension, veteran support, family tax benefits, and pharmaceutical benefits. Vital Australian institutions like the ABC and the ABS are also set to receive significant reductions in funding in real terms. The poorest Australians will also be required to bear accelerated debt servicing payments with no extra assistance from the wealthy. Put simply, in the 2020s, the wealth Australians generate for the nation is not going to be spent as fairly as it used to be. And unless the government can find more ways to make the poor prop up the budget, like bullying the poor through unlawful robo-debt schemes, it's not going to be spent at all. Other policy settings aggravating the problem of inequality include refusals to make corporations pay proper tax, resources rents and royalties, antipathy to the provision of a decent welfare safety net, and a real killer, smaller government participation in wealth-generating human services and profitable government trading enterprises. These and other policy failures are all acting together to hollow out the middle class. Over the last decade, the middle class has been getting smaller and the numbers of poor are growing. And because the direction in which Australians are being pushed out of the middle class is down, not up, we have been experiencing slower growth of our economy. Since about 2015, well before the recession brought on by coronavirus, Australia has been verging towards economy-wide recession. Now, with the onset of the pandemic in 2020, Australians can only expect that future budgets will be set up to embed inequality even more deeply than it has been already. Growing inequality won't just make things worse for the less well-off. It will inevitably make our economy smaller than it need be. It can have no other outcome. We will all be worse off unless we reverse the socio-economic inequality being embedded in Australia. On the side of good news here, there is evidence that Australians want to reverse this trend of growing inequality. It is clear from the ABC Australia Talks national survey of 55,000 Australians in 2019 that 76% of Australians think this sort of disparity in wealth and income is too wide. There is still a sense of cohesion and generosity in Australia that can be built on to grow our economy, particularly if Australians organise themselves to have a greater say on the priorities for investing fairly and cleverly in our nation's growth. There is a practical opportunity here that most Australians would take up. Australian Community Futures Planning has been established to help more Australians make the most of their nation by planning to reverse this trend of growing inequality. To do that, we need to understand the depth of Australians' problems with growing poverty. In Australia today, it's estimated that over 3 million people are living in poverty, meaning they are living on an income that is half or less than half of the median income for Australian households. These are pre-COVID-19 estimates. Even many Australians with a full-time job are living below the poverty line, and they were living that way before COVID-19. Of those Australians deemed to be living in poverty between 2017 and 2019, almost 25% had a full-time job. They've been living, if it can be called that, on half or less than half of what the majority of Australian households are living on, even though they have a full-time job. Employment is now not enough to shield over 1 million employed Australians from poverty, let alone their children. Based on figures supplied by the ABS, the Australian Council of Social Service and the University of New South Wales have estimated that as at 2018, over 13% of Australians were living in poverty. Over 17% of children under 15, or 774,000 children, were living in poverty. And almost 14% of young people aged between 15 and 24 years were living in poverty. This is based on a conservative measure of the numbers in poverty, and the situation has only got worse, not better, since 2018. Growing homelessness is a key feature of this level of poverty. Since the 2006 census, the number of homeless people in Australia has increased by almost 30%, or almost 27,000 extra people. This is not just a numerical increase, it is an increase in per capita terms. We could half fill the seats of one of Sydney's planned new football stadiums just with those 27,000 extra people every night. We could fill more than 2 of those stadiums every night with the total number who were homeless on the 2016 census night. And despite the suggestions made in 2019 by Federal Minister for Homelessness and Community Housing, Luke Howarth, that we should look on the bright side of homelessness and put a positive spin on it, there is no bright side to these plain facts, especially for children caught in this growing problem. The vast majority of Australians may assume they're immune from this sort of hardship, but the young are particularly exposed. Housing affordability has a disproportionate effect not just on the poor, but on the youngest among the better off. For the young, secure housing can no longer be taken for granted in Australia. And then, of course, there's the hunger. In 2018-19, the number of people seeking food relief in Australia increased by 22%. A total of 21% of Australians experienced food insecurity. At least once a week, 30% of food insecure Australians went without eating for a whole day, and only 37% of charities reported being able to meet the full needs of people they assisted with food. And this is all before the onset of coronavirus. Imagine what it's like in 2020. In a wealthy country, there should be none of this. Certainly, no child should have to go hungry, and yet they do, every day. This prevails despite the fact that in 2015, Australia adopted the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to end poverty in all its forms everywhere and to end hunger. We have adopted targets to halve the number of Australians living in poverty and end hunger, particularly for Australian children, by 2030. These are not hard things to do, but we have made no progress since the 1990s. In fact, the numbers of poor are rising in Australia at the rate of about 100,000 a year. In the 2 years to 2018, the number of children in poverty increased by 4.7%. Young people aged 15 to 24 in poverty increased by 3.6%, and those living on half or less than half of the median wage grew by 6.1%. And these people generally do not languish in poverty for a short time. They get all too easily stuck. And in that case, the cost of services to help them rises beyond what it would cost simply to lift them from poverty in the first place by direct financial welfare payments. In other words, by an increase in New Start, now called Job Seeker. Research shows that there is a clear connection between expenditures to diminish poverty, hunger and homelessness and achieving savings on policing, prisons, health and social services of every kind. The savings to government can outweigh the costs of the welfare payments, and when all the employment and wealth generation opportunities that come from programs to eliminate poverty and provide people with homes are taken into account, the overall benefit to the economy and businesses is far greater than the cost. In the USA, where more than 1 in 5 children grow up poor, countless studies have already shown that anti-poverty measures actually work as a cost-cutting instrument. Australians can strengthen our economy if we take the goals we have committed to seriously. Alternatively, we can see our economy spiral into decline if we keep on needlessly excluding millions of Australians from participation in it. Providing a fair go for all is essential for economic growth. But unfortunately, the fair go for all is disappearing in Australia, as I'll show in the next issue. Most Australians would agree that nothing could be more Australian than the fair go for all. And up until about 2014, Australians were getting a fair share of any growth in the national wealth they worked hard to generate. But all that changed quite markedly in 2014 with the election of a Conservative federal government, and it changed in some significant policy respects. One of these was that the federal government chipped away at welfare services for the most vulnerable Australians at exactly the time they needed these things most, and placed demeaning conditions on their access to social support. This has now got so bad that in many cases, people on welfare no longer have the rights that everyone else has to determine how they shall lawfully live their lives. Their expenditure decisions are being heavily hamstrung by the introduction of a cashless welfare card. A second policy change was a perverse refusal by the government to provide the economic stimulus necessary to create enough jobs for people on welfare to apply for, and to expand the number of job opportunities in the public sector or replace jobs they have removed. A third change was to harass unions and those workers who were simply seeking fairer shares of national wealth and more opportunities to contribute through transparent and cooperative collective bargaining. A fourth change involved the government and big business working together in such a way as to passively and actively shift the economy into a mode that has slowed productivity. One result of these and other serious policy missteps at both the federal and state levels is that since 2014, growth in hourly rates of pay has been slower than average annual growth in GDP. So Australians are no longer getting a fair share of economic growth. In fact, since 2014, wages have been growing at almost half the rate of growth we enjoyed over the previous 15 years. The drop in wages growth has coincided with a drop in GDP, but business profits in this same period have been enormous compared to the shares of benefit that have been enjoyed by working Australians. Company profits have grown 5 times as much as wages, in part because since 2015, the federal government has focused on locking in policy settings that have assisted businesses to keep wages low while profits have run high. During this period, businesses have largely diverted profits to their shareholders, clamped wage growth disproportionately, and substantially reduced reinvestment of profits in new capital assets, research, and education. In short, the government has set priorities that stop the sort of investment that would enable workers to deliver the productivity gains necessary to grow the economy. Over the 5 years between 2014 and 2019, growth in new capital investment by private sector businesses has been negative, averaging minus 1.6% per quarter. Huge profits have not encouraged business to invest, let alone trickle down the benefits of any of the profit to the workers who generated it. This is stoking growth of inequality, which in turn is slowly but steadily strangling the overall economic growth. The refusal to invest has of course led to a drop in productivity. In the 30 years to 2014, Australian workers and businesses managed to work together to increase productivity on average by 1.6% every year. But since 2015, labour productivity has increased at only a third of that rate, less than 0.5% a year. This shouldn't be surprising. After all, how can workers be expected to increase productivity while working with aged equipment and outdated technology? The prospects for increasing the size of our economy and the prospects for growth in individual wealth will both be poor, while ever investment is withheld by the private sector. And this will be made worse if government sector investment likewise continues to be withheld. For as long as participation in the economy is prevented by large-scale diversion of profits to shareholders and a refusal by government itself to create jobs where it could, the fair go for all will not be an Australian reality. There are big job opportunities in services where demand is growing, such as health, education, renewable energy and buildings efficiency, housing and land care. There is nothing standing in the way of the government itself offering jobs in these sectors to utilise the spare capacity in Australia's willing labour force. A lack of money isn't the problem here. Australia is a wealthy country and can set its priorities for spending in these areas where it will get the best returns on investment for all Australians. But in the last 5 years, the priorities have been set more distinctly in favour of the few, not the many. Instead of telling the unemployed to apply for jobs it persists in refusing to create, the government could simply set to work expanding Australia's publicly owned health, welfare, education, energy and conservation services. This could employ hundreds of thousands of people who would then be able to once again grow the economy and their own income and wealth. The government says all its effort is going into job creation, but the reality is that the fair go is largely missing in both private and public sector employment. The situation has deteriorated to the point where Australia's private sector is now corralling 85% of working Australians into the total jobs on offer, but underpaying them and using them so inefficiently that they are producing only 75% of the GDP. By contrast, the public sector is employing the other 15% of working Australians into the remaining available jobs, and these people are producing 25% of our GDP. It's not so much the disparity between the two sectors in their contributions to GDP that is the issue here. The issue is that the labour force could be so much more effectively utilised than it is, particularly by the private sector. Say what some might about the validity of this comparison. The facts are correct, and this should prompt inquiries into the way we have structured our economy and balanced investment and competition between the two sectors, public and private. The anti-competitive regulatory settings that encourage investment in less productive things, for instance, in fossil fuel subsidies, and withdraw it from other potentially more productive markets, for instance, education, social services and health. These anti-competitive policy settings are long overdue for review. Australia has had a lacklustre record since 2015 in its management of labour and its capital investment, particularly in the private sector. And this is having significant effects on the ability of Australians to get a fair go. Other policy settings are also chipping away at the fair go. Welfare conditionality has been introduced in Australia. In other words, the tests and thresholds that people must satisfy to qualify for welfare are constantly being tightened to the point where Australians who must rely on the welfare safety net are being shut out unfairly, unreasonably, and unnecessarily. Australians relying on welfare, including aged pensioners, veterans, the disabled, families with children, the sick, and the unemployed, are contributing to the economy, even though they may not be in work. They are not leaners. On the contrary, in the structure of Australia's economy, their demand is a major source of our economic growth. Provisions for health and welfare equate to about half of what the federal government injects into our economy every year. This is a stimulant, not a burden. 13% of Australia's labour force works in this service. So imagine how the economy would shrink if the spending of those on welfare was not part of our economy, and how many other Australians would no longer be employable in health and social services that are central to our quality of life. Australians are being taught to think that welfare is a burden to the economy, when in fact it boosts the economy probably more than any other sector, and always has. Nevertheless, since 2014, welfare conditionality has been unleashed on Australians who are now being hounded to apply for jobs that simply don't exist. And if they don't apply, their meagre welfare payments are cut off. We are being told we'll get a go if we have a go. But in a country where, even before the pandemic, there was only one job for every 7 unemployed and underemployed people who were seeking a job, this was nothing but an outright lie to 6 out of every 7 job seekers. And still, the government refused to increase benefits for the unemployed or create the jobs themselves within the public sector. People caught in this trap were required to live in 2019 on $40 a day. At least they were until the onset of the coronavirus pandemic, and it is likely that policy settings will revert to this sort of austerity when the pandemic passes. This New Start rate, now called Job Seeker, is almost 70% below the median income for Australians and almost 40% below the poverty line itself. Since the pandemic, it has been temporarily increased, but only temporarily. This imposition of entrenched abject poverty on hundreds of thousands of Australians trying to have a go was occurring well before the onset of COVID-19. The government's policy response to coronavirus aggravated the situation by providing welfare only for some and shutting another few 100,000 working Australians arbitrarily out of a safe transition through the pandemic. The Prime Minister Scott Morrison has stated that austerity will not be resorted to in Australia in recovery from the pandemic. But austerity has actually been with us for some time. It has already actually been hardwired into the structure of our economy and our welfare and industrial relations systems. We avoided austerity in the GFC with government policies that stimulated the economy. But since 2014, austerity has crept deep into the Australian way of life. All told, the fair go for all in Australia has been replaced by the fair go for some and the much fairer go for a privileged few. In the unemployment crisis created by COVID-19, austerity policies may be loosened to provide a permanent increase in the New Start job seeker rate, but if this is implemented in an unfair way, the result can only be a deepening of inequality. Australians may remember the Abbott government's first budget in 2014, the budget which the Treasurer Joe Hockey promoted as the one heralding the end of the age of entitlement. We may have assumed that most of that was rejected and not implemented. But in fact, the austerity it heralded was brought about quietly in all the subsequent federal budgets. And unless we reverse the Morrison government's agenda of continued reduced spending and reverse the agenda of legislated tax cuts, cuts we could not afford before COVID-19, let alone after, then those at the bottom who are trying to have a go will definitely not get a go in the 2020 decade in Australia. Aggravating that prospect, the federal government is also attempting to lead with a legislative and policy program that stands to embed racial and religious conflict. A cohesive society is vital for economic growth, especially in a country where growth is so heavily dependent on immigration. But we're not doing well here, hence the importance of examining the state of our cohesion as a multicultural nation, to which I'll now turn. Australia is a country that has thrived in multiculturalism and diversity, and most Australians appreciate that. According to the Scanlon Foundation, an organisation that has independently surveyed social cohesion annually for more than a decade in Australia, 85% of Australians agree or strongly agree with the statement that multiculturalism has been good for Australia. But the reality is that on the ground, that sense of appreciation of multiculturalism has declined over the last decade, enough to make many Australians feel excluded. Between 2007 and 2017, Australians indicating a sense of rejection and reporting experience of discrimination because of their skin colour, ethnic origin or religion more than doubled, from 9% to 20%. Regrettably, this lines up with the fact that in the same decade, Australians strongly disagreeing with the statement that accepting migrants from many different countries makes Australia stronger rose from 8% to 13%. Strong disagreement that immigration is a good thing for Australia dropped again in 2019, but only to 12%. Overall, there is a clear trend of more Australians rejecting immigration and diversity. The Scanlon Foundation measures 5 key responses from Australians to create an index of our social cohesion. This includes our responses about our sense of belonging, sense of worth, our sense of social justice and equity, political participation, and whether we've been accepted or rejected, in other words, whether we've experienced discrimination or a negative attitude on racial, religious, or cultural grounds. From the baseline of 100 set in the first Scanlon Foundation survey in 2007, the index of the average of these 5 responses has improved from the baseline only once, way back in 2009. Thereafter, it has been trending downhill in terms of our sense of belonging, our sense of worth, and our sense of social justice and equity. The only area of improvement in social cohesion is in political participation and activism, which has risen each time we have perceived a drop in social justice and equity. The relationship between a rise in political activism and a perception of declining social justice and equity is quite defined and strongly correlated. When Australians perceive growing injustice and inequity, we get out and protest. But the real point at which our cohesion as a society is being broken is so clearly along racial lines. And to the extent that some political leaders and Australians make racial distinctions along religious lines, our cohesion is falling apart on two interrelated parts of one front. The number of Australians who are responding that they feel a sense of rejection and discrimination on the grounds of race, culture, and religion is rising, as is the number who are conversely displaying negative views about government support for ethnic minorities. We are noticeably becoming more intolerant and less appreciative of the multicultural diversity that we have usually thought of as a reason for our success as a nation. It is a concern that this decline in tolerance is occurring at a time when Australia's government is running a legislative and policy program that is stoking religious conflict and racial resentment, rather than promoting harmony and enjoyment of diversity. The Religious Discrimination Bill, put out for public comment in 2019, was meant to prevent discrimination on the grounds of religion. But the drafts actually legitimise some new forms of discrimination, in that they will allow some organisations and people to discriminate where they never could before. If passed, this legislation will newly allow them to openly discriminate on the grounds of religion, in both employment and in provision of taxpayer-funded services. This is of such concern that the Australian Human Rights Commission called for wholesale changes of provisions in the draft legislation, which in the Commission's view limit other human rights in a way that is unnecessary and disproportionate or otherwise inconsistent with international law. If it is ever passed by Parliament, this bill will legitimise religious discrimination, something entirely at odds with the direction of the vast majority of Australian culture, which is in fact moving consistently towards secularity. While the majority of Australians still identify as having some religious belief, several surveys over the last decade have shown that religion is not important to nearly 70% of Australians in their daily lives. And while the census shows growth in the number of Australians identifying as religious, the percentage of our total population that is religious has dropped from almost 90% in 1966 to 60% in 2016, while those identifying as having no religion has grown from near zero to 30% in the same period. And this shift to secularity is accelerating. Between 2006 and 2016, Australians identifying as religious grew in number by 438,000 people, a 3.2% increase, although all of it was in non-Christian religions. The number indicating Christian religious belief declined. Beside this, those identifying as having no religion grew by 3.3 million people, a 90% increase and nearly 8 times the pace of growth in religious belief. Nevertheless, religious influences have been setting the legislative agenda, pushing religious discrimination legislation up the priority line ahead of items that are more urgent to larger numbers of Australians, such as climate change and a federal corruption watchdog. This upending of priorities, providing legislation for protection of rights to churches, who are the only group that has protected rights already under our Constitution, is more of a divisive step than it is a unifying one. We need to organise our legislative agenda so that priorities are fairly set and no one, religious or secular, misses out. Many religious Australians and church leaders support the need to get the priorities right here, and that climate change is of paramount importance. It is vitally important for Australian legislators to attempt to prevent discrimination on the grounds of religious belief. But if legislation for this purpose is set up to create new grounds on which minorities can suffer discrimination, it will divide us rather than bring us together. It will aggravate the growing resentment of multiculturalism that we are now clearly experiencing and decimate our already declining social cohesion. Nor is this sort of exclusion a path to prosperity and economic growth. Anything that excludes participation of diverse human talents reduces growth and prosperity. Australia is embedding a legislative, policy and administrative program that is driving up division, and this is flowing over into the creation of a new class system, a system where the prosperous are deemed worthy and deserving of inclusion by virtue of their prosperity, and the poor are deemed unworthy by virtue of their poverty or lower socioeconomic status. We are moving towards a system where wealth defines worthiness. Meanwhile, legislation and policy offerings that promote cohesion are waning, almost to the point of being non-existent. This is in turn hardening Australian attitudes to welfare, to supporting each other without judgmentalism. The impact of this subtle change in the Australian character and our values about fairness and appreciation of diversity can't be understated. To the extent that we shift towards exclusion, and particularly towards intolerance of diversity, we are locking ourselves out of accessing our full human capital. That can only mean slower economic growth, if not decline. Big business leaders and thinkers, like those who supported the development of the Australian National Outlook 2019, know this to be true. They have described two outlooks for Australia by 2060, one of slow social and economic decline, and one of higher growth and shared prosperity. Their most optimistic predictions for our economy depend heavily on our maintaining highly inclusive economic institutions and markets. In their considered expertise, a divided society that is unappreciative of diversity will make the most pessimistic economic scenario a reality. This is straight common sense. Excluding diverse talents will make for a fragile economy, not a resilient one capable of carrying more of us to prosperity. Any plan about Australia's future that does not seek to fix inequality, racial and religious prejudice, unfairness in opportunity, and reduce government sector participation in our economy will not deliver a decent future and a good quality of life for Australians. In other words, any plan that does not capitalise on diversity, as we have in the past, will not succeed in terms of either social cohesion or economic benefit. Social and economic breakdown in Australia can, however, still be quite easily avoided. Here, diversity has always been a strength, and Australia has not yet fallen into an irreparable state of decline. But before we do slip into problems such as those we can clearly observe in America, it would be advisable to heed the suggestions of the Australian National Outlook about the economic value of social inclusion. And perhaps the best place for Australia to start is to reverse the exclusion that has been suffered for over 200 years by Australia's First Nations. Indigenous exclusion is entrenched in Australia, and this prevails despite the fact that some governments have tried to address the problem or parts of it. On balance, things are getting worse, not better, for First Nations peoples. Proportionally, Indigenous Australians are the most incarcerated people on earth. This is a fact. Our rate of incarceration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders even exceeds the rate for African American people in the USA. Imprisonment rates for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia are more than 10 times the imprisonment rate for all adult Australians. This is not because First Nations people, who acted as custodians of Australia for 60,000 years before Europeans arrived, are an innately criminal people. They are not. And this is racist nonsense. In 1991, recognising that our Indigenes were suffering disproportionately in the justice system, Australia held a Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. But despite the passage of 30 years, recommendations of the Commission, which focused on strategies to prevent deaths in custody, mainly by seeking alternatives to incarceration, have either not been implemented or have been implemented only in part. Little wonder that rates of imprisonment have doubled for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in that 30-year period, and that from time to time we see that all prisoners in youth detention facilities in the Northern Territory are Indigenous. The higher rate of incarceration itself is undoubtedly also the result of racial profiling, discrimination, and what one coroner has called unconscious bias that is ingrained in the attitudes of some police and public administrators. Aborigines are being arrested and taken into custody for behaviours that would be far less likely to result in arrest in the case of a white person, and so it was in the case of Tanya Day. Tanya Day died after being taken into custody merely because she was asleep on a train. The coroner found that Tanya was subjected to systemic discrimination influenced by the fact that she was Aboriginal. These ingrained attitudes are bleeding on in our society, not just because less than 2/3 of the Royal Commission's recommendations have been fully implemented, but because Australia is not addressing systemic issues that embed exclusion of our First Nations inhabitants. We are making systemic issues worse. Although the rate of Aboriginal deaths in custody has reportedly decreased since the Royal Commission, at least 435 Indigenous Australians are now known to have died in custody between 2008 and 2020. Of course, more non-Indigenous people in custody have died, but not as a proportion of the non-Indigenous population, and not from the same causes. Continuing death rates for Indigenes have been found to be largely the result of government failures to follow their own procedures and provide appropriate medical care to Indigenous people in custody. The lack of care from governments is exemplified by the fact that deaths in custody have been inadequately tracked by the government since the Royal Commission. These statistics have been assembled instead by dedicated journalists who took the time to read hundreds of reports on coronial inquiries to find out just how bad the situation still is and what is causing these grossly disproportional death rates. Of course, the causes are deeper than just mistreatment in custody. It should be no surprise that Indigenous imprisonment rates have doubled since the Royal Commission, bearing in mind that Aboriginal families are still being broken up at an appallingly higher rate than non-Indigenous families by institutional intrusion. Aboriginal children are being removed from their families at far greater rates than all other Australians. This too is systemically embedded. In 2018, the rate of Indigenous children in out-of-home care was 59.4 per 1,000 children, 11 times the rate for non-Indigenous children, which was only 5.2 per 1,000. It's estimated that by 2018, anywhere between 18,000 and 20,000 Indigenous children were living in out-of-home care, an approximate 20% increase in just 4 years. One Indigenous professional working in this field has put forward the idea that we are experiencing a second stolen generation, because if the figures of 20,000 plus Indigenous children in care are correct, then the numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care now exceed the numbers removed through the stolen generations. This rate of removal is being systemically locked in by the creation and entrenchment of a whole new industry of professionals, lawyers, social workers, education specialists, medical professionals, and psychologists, all of whom benefit financially from Indigenous disadvantage and the overrepresentation in out-of-home care. These well-meaning professionals now habitually use a method of service delivery for Indigenous families that is entirely lopsided, placing far too much emphasis on removal of Indigenous children from their families and far too little on the type of early intervention support that is provided for non-Indigenous families and which is known to be very effective at assisting children to stay in their homes. Government investment in out-of-home care supports, like foster care and kinship care, has far exceeded the support provided to Indigenous families before the removal of their children occurs. In other words, the support that could have prevented child removal is being discarded in favour of the more expensive late intervention approach of child removal. This is by far the most expensive way to deal with family support. The cost to government of late intervention in Australia has been estimated at $15.2 billion each year. The greatest costs, 39%, are services for children in out-of-home care, and of course the greatest proportion of that expense is for Indigenous children. It would be far cheaper simply to support Indigenous families to stay together. Excessive rates of incarceration and removal of children from their families make up just two of the reasons why Australia's First Nations have called for an Indigenous voice in the Constitution in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It is clear to them that their children are still being alienated from their families at unprecedented rates. It is fundamental that this cannot be because they have no love for them. Their young languish in detention centres in obscene numbers when they should be the hope of the future. To begin to address these injustices and move forward, they make a simple call. They seek constitutional reforms to empower their peoples on a footing of equality with other Australians. And in this regard, they are offering a gift of extraordinary value. The benefit that Australia and Australians would gain if we did the simple thing and recognised the voice of First Nations in the Constitution would far exceed mere budgetary gains. Australia's continuing failures in Indigenous recognition and reconciliation are standing in the way of our ability to define ourselves as a nation and state what decency means for us. When our Indigenes speak from the heart about the gift their recognition would be to Australia, the value of such a gift to non-Indigenes can't be overstated. If in a constitutional convention we start from the position suggested in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, we can only go forward into decency. It will not only be Indigenous children that will flourish, it will be all Australians. That is why the next episode in this series on the state of Australia in 2020 starts with the facts about Australia's Constitution and how in 2020 it is in need of a considered overhaul, not just for First Australians, but for all of us. Any plan for the future of Australia should include a commitment to make space and time for all Australians to become involved in development of a new constitution. One fit for a 21st century, inclusive, prosperous nation. One fit for a truly liberal democracy. One fit for a genuinely reconciled community. Australia Together can schedule that forum. You can become involved in developing Australia Together by visiting ACFP at www.austcfp.com.au. Thanks for watching this episode. For further episodes in this series of the State of Australia in 2020, visit ACFP at www.austcfp.com.au, or stay tuned for episode 3 on our Constitution, our loss of rights, and our declining participation in democracy. If you like this episode, please click like on the YouTube page and share the episode with your friends and subscribe to this channel.